Extras. We all know I'm not the fastest at making these episodes. I haven't tried to count the man hours put into each one. It'd be very hard to count because sometimes, especially closer to release of an episode, I'm pushing through and working pretty efficiently, whereas other times, especially in the scripting phase and early in the editing of the episode, I find it hard to work 100%, get distracted more easily, as though I'm recovering from the hard work of the last week and a half of the episode I just finished. And, of course, working full-time in a brain-intensive job the whole time. But the vast majority of my free time is spent either working on TDDC, planning actual D&D for Tuesdays, plus about 5 hours of my weekend now goes towards playing in our Sunday Morning Heroes 5th Ed campaign, and editing those videos. Briarstone, aka Reginald Black, is our GM and stream host for that, so he's doing all the hard work, and I'm mostly just playing, which counts as leisure time, mostly. If you only know him from my portrayal in TDDC, you may be surprised, because Black is really an against-type sort of character for Briarstone. But episode 37 took longer for a couple of stupid reasons. One, I was unable to find any maps of Polaron. Obviously, I had maps at the time, 2 to 3 years ago, but as far as I can tell, searching my Gmail, my old hard drive archives, and old near-dead laptop, I can't find any sign of the files, and if they had been paper maps, well, I searched every place I had papers and found no sign of those either. I knew the rough layout of Polaron quite well. It's not exactly complicated in general terms. But it's annoying that I don't have the exact details I'd added in, plus, without digital files, I had to waste time reproducing even the basic elements, like the square rings of the atrium. On the plus side, if I was going to rebuild the damn thing, I know well enough now to make it in a huge size so that I was able to zoom in and out and use the big map of Polaron to help tell the story in places, especially when they're moving around, exploring large chunks that never had that much detail. And I say it's simple, but I had to find a way to show the crisscrossing bridges above and below while making it clear, or as clear as possible, which was the current level, which I did by trying to darken them more the further up and down they were from the current bridge. Then I had to synchronize them when animating moves around so that I could fade from one to the next to show the different side rooms around the edge of each floor of the facility, because some of them are vertically superimposed. But between the missing maps and missing audio, and somehow mostly missing GM notes for the upper areas, I had almost nothing but my memory to go on from the moment they left security, and that's when the audio failed, only a few minutes into the session, all the way until they tried to rest. Fortunately, there was a session break there, and I did have full audio notes from the next session, including the search for Rainbowdash, allowing me to preserve all the authentic, reactions. On the subject of Rainbowdash, though, yes, it was partially the PC's fault for not remembering to go back for her after the better part of a session fighting their way through all those reserve units in security. But it's also partially my fault for not having her charge down the hall on her own and trample stuff when they were fighting in the same big tunnel at the beginning of this episode. That would have been a cool moment, and we're treating her as Little One's leadership cohort. She may not have that helm of intelligence he wants to get her, but she has wisdom and instinct and really ought to have that degree of initiative when she hears fighting down there. The rescue attempt was fun. It was splitting the party, but they could have done it with better rolls. And the full party rescue was at least a little cathartic, but I really just need to remember the NPCs. Angel definitely keeps track of Mora, but I forget Liz all the damn time as well, though at least she isn't a cohort. Due to the above-mentioned issues and their lack of reaction to it at different stages, I am pretty sure the party never got around to checking out the other of those two rooms off security, which is bizarre to me because that's where they would have found a golem repair arm sticking out of the floor, similar to the ones they had seen near Ginneron Controller, which was key to getting those destroyed golems back into action as quickly as they have been. In case you're wondering, I did maintain a chart listing the total numbers of all the different golem and worker types in Polaron, where I could track how many of each were active, inactive, below 0 HP, or destroyed. as in PCs spent significant extra effort smashing them after they went down, or threw something other than a magma sifter into the magma. On my chart, I could tell how many inactive golems there were because those ones could be repaired in a reasonable amount of time, in priority order. Top priority was to have a sufficient number of certain types to maintain essential functions, but after that, the controller would mainly repair them in order of combat effectiveness. I deemed units destroyed if they were either permanently gone, like most units would be if tossed into the lava, or if they would just take too long to repair to have any impact on the party's dungeon run. I find it interesting that, though they talked about it a lot, the party rarely actually threw units into the lava or otherwise spent extra time trashing them. Then again, they were still hoping that, unlike Ginneron, Polaron and his forces could be saved and convinced, or Magitech reprogrammed, to eventually work for them. The events of Polaron, starting in episode 36, took place over many game sessions. I had created a number of new enemies with special abilities, and I had to make some rules decisions and balance changes along the way. For one thing, in security, when Little One was taking that horrendous beating, I chickened out a little on the Polaron charges, changing them to 5 electrical damage when discharged. They were originally written as 10 damage per charge, which makes them a lot more relevant, borderline scary, even for well-equipped characters of levels in the low teens. So far, the only thing they've seen that could discharge them is the Slicing Golem's Whirlwind attack, but unlike the time Little One stood in the middle of security and got pounded by the entire room, normally it takes some work to accumulate a large number of charges. At 10 damage per charge, still lumped together as a single attack for resistance purposes, low-level energy resistance spells would still make a significant difference, but even a mass resist at caster level 11, giving the entire group 30 resistance to a chosen element, wouldn't make them fully immune. And the minions, especially the shooting model, which can apply charges as a non-damaging ranged touch attack, become what minions are intended to be, a fragile enemy which can be scary if you don't kill them fast enough. So yes, 90 damage from the 9 charges, which could have exploded Little One, despite his 5 electrical resist, was pretty scary, but remember, those never got discharged, and that was before they knew to watch out for it. It becomes more fair once they know the information, and also, when the charges were a paltry 5 damage, I was treating them as lasting a minute, like a whole encounter effectively, because otherwise they would rarely be worth the effort. Restored to their proper 10 damage potency, I also changed the duration back to 3 rounds, counting from the last time you get a charge. This means that if somebody builds up too many charges, they can flee combat for a couple rounds, get around a corner, let them fade away, and still have a chance to get back before the fighting ends. If I were writing this up as a module, I would want to do a couple of things differently. First, I would make a weaker enemy that could discharge up to 2 charges on hit, probably with a ranged attack, and make sure that enemy type had a good chance to do so in the first fight. All minions, and even the basic Atronium golems, give out charges, but there was nothing early on to trigger those charges. The mystery was fun, but from a dungeon design perspective, I would want to show the players 3 important new game mechanics. A. Charges can be dangerous. B. Some enemies have attacks which can discharge charges to do bad things to you. And C. It's possible to discharge more than 1 per attack. Second, I would invent a special effect that would indicate which enemies can discharge charges, such as arcs of sparking energy around their weapons, or maybe a consistently described, disconcerting humming noise around those particular units. The first time it would still be a surprise, but when you describe that effect in the future, they should quickly learn to tell which newly discovered enemy types can discharge Polaron charges without actually knowing what will happen when they do. Mostly damage. Although, interestingly, the shield unit has 2 different abilities which I'm pretty sure I managed to never actually use, even though I designed them basically for the instructive purposes described above. They have no attack, and their actual shield generating function happens automatically, with no action, so I gave them 2 standard actions to choose from. Pulse Wave, which automatically adds 1 Polaron charge to each other creature within 30 feet, and Defensive Pulse. All living creatures within 10 feet must make a DC 12 will save or be stunned for 1 round. DC is +4 per Polaron charge on the target. This ability does not expend charges, but any creature that fails a save becomes immune to defensive pulse for the following round. So it can't fully stun lock you, but it does have a strong defensive capability when not being obliterated in one round. And I should note, the invisible spider climb version of the shield generator does not have those abilities. It has plenty of abilities, just being invisible on the ceiling. But that is interesting because it shows that there can be abilities which have their save DC increased by charges without the charges being used up. The Slicing Golem also went through a rules change. I knew what I wanted it to do, but I went back and forth. In this episode, it was portrayed as a whirlwind attack with a pretty significant attack bonus, meaning it makes an attack against each enemy in range, and if it hit, of course, discharges any Polaron charges for big bonus damage. However, there are a lot of attacking enemies in this dungeon, in the campaign as a whole. I've actually been a little bad for that throughout the campaign, focused much less on magic than I really should have been, partly because the party is less spellcasty than normal themselves, until recently using almost all Black and Draven's magic for buffs rather than flashy spells, and in large part because I was just going with the flavor of the enemies I wanted to include. Anyhow, to change up the mix a little, I changed the Slicing Golem's attack to be reflex for half, still against adjacent enemies. It's DC 22 reflex save, but only discharging charges if you fail the save. This has the drawback of making Angel virtually immune, but overall, it means it is more likely to deal some damage, basically guaranteed against anyone without evasion, yet is less likely to hit you with all those deadly charges, while still being quite threatening. The fire suppression unit you saw in the episode was already an evolution of the rules, because the first design, the one used during the actual bridge fight, was interesting, but very weird and not very intuitive. The original idea was, it has this crazy armor class, but as soon as you hit it with one attack, a non-touch damage-dealing attack roll, you shatter all the ice armor, after which it continues to slowly grow back, but you're probably hitting it more often, so it keeps breaking, so it never builds up again. This made the fight really random. You needed to get lucky and hit the AC of 40, and until you do, it's super frustrating and lame. Then, once you do, its AC is permanently stuck in the 26 to 28 range, and it might as well be a normal golem unless it lives long enough for its cone of cold to recharge. The version you saw, where misses gradually whittle down the AC, still eventually reaches the point where its armor bottoms out, but it happens more gradually over 2 to 3 rounds, and instead of feeling impotent until somebody gets that lucky hit, it's the opposite. Every attack feels like you're making progress, even when you miss. Much more fun. Anyway, my view of game balance as a GM is that assuming your players respect the game, they aren't literally trying to wreck it, they want a good story and to have fun and play mostly in character, that it's best to try to avoid banning spells and character options without a lot of consideration. But when it comes to enemies, it's good to take risks sometimes, trying out new ways to change up the action in combat, new ways to challenge the PCs. It's especially important if the characters are getting overpowered, as they're starting to be in TDDC. So much item crafting. They can take one hell of a beating, dish out a ton of damage, and they have a lot of utility as well if they choose to use it wisely. That means that I not only can, but actually have to step it up somehow to make combat more challenging, and have faith that they can handle it. There's no reason that every fight has to be hard. It's fine for them to run over fights here and there for variety. It can be fun, but in a campaign like this, there need to be hard battles too. But whether you're taking big risks or not so much, you also have to be willing to make changes as needed to the enemies. If some weird ability isn't working as planned, fix it. Either on the fly, if you or the players have an idea of that makes more sense, or think about it between fights or between sessions to sort it out. If you are actually changing how something works, like my FSS ice armor, then make sure to explain the changes and the reasoning to your players. If an enemy type is too weak or too strong, you don't necessarily have to discuss that. Just change future copies of that enemy, and, when they see them, describe how they seem to be bigger, stronger, faster, or whatever version of what they've seen so far. If you think your change will make the game more interesting, that's a pretty good justification. Like everything else, this can be done well or done poorly, and it probably takes experience and knowledge of your players to get it right, but you don't gain that experience unless you try something every now and then. One off-topic question on the channel was, do the Kua only care about conquering the Fadelands, or do they have their eyes set on the Feywild and the Shadowfell as well? Interestingly, the Diluvian religious dogma, the Temple of Blabal, is really focused on the Fadelands. The leadership does think about threats and opportunities of the other planes somewhat. Even with the Civil War, the Empire is too large not to devote some magic and intelligence resources to such things. And nobody doubts that if they really conquered the whole world, they would immediately start looking for the next one. Bet you can't eat just one. But the common Kua is really only thinking about the plane they live in, because they've been taught all their lives for countless generations that this world is their divine right. This week's Patreon question, Warsaw asked, did the controller have any idea what they were doing when Rope Trick was used, or was it completely baffled? I know we had a good discussion on the use of Rope Trick in another video, and just thought this situation was one where, because they were inside an enemy base, such a trick could backfire on them if the enemy was capable of recognizing it was being used tactically. You did have the ball roll by, which at least showed the players that stuff was still going on while they rested, which was cool. There was definitely stuff going on while they rested. Fortunately for them, though, Polaron's teleportation detector is based on the spell Greater Anticipate Teleportation, and thus it only detects actual teleportation effects, and not other planar effects like Rope Trick. Plus, the controller is frankly not at its best, with the number of units out of commission, and between the unpredictable attacks by this strange entity, and now the appearance of facility staff after so much time, some of them moving around normally, others appearing to attack the defending units, which then causes the controller to lose vision. It doesn't have the sensor coverage it once did, relying more on constructs to be its eyes, and the whole situation has the controller confused. If there were a reduction in the destructive attacks for a period, like when they rested, it could use that time to attempt to reconcile the large amount of conflicting information, as well as to focus on reconstructing critical defensive units. I'm usually pretty good about answering questions in YouTube comments, but if you have a great question about an episode you want answered in extras for everyone, my Patreon patrons get these videos about a week early, and if you have a question I can answer, I add it to the final version of this that goes out on YouTube. Thanks so much to all my Patreon patrons for your continued support, with a special shout out to Pericles, Kurt, and Gandurk, the members of the organization, who are helping support me so I can keep making TDDC for everyone. If you enjoyed this, please click the like button, or on your touchscreen, please lick the like button. Warning, licking the touchscreen is not recommended.